It could bring this campaign to an end tonight if it were to accept an end to the rocketing of Israel, which means decoupling the Hamas Iranian association with Gaza, that justification, and to move its forces back. That would end the damage in Lebanon. It would end the fighting immediately. But Hezbollah has refused.
Well, the US President Joe Biden and his Vice President Kamala Harris have both attended events to commemorate the anniversary of the 7th October attacks in Israel. Joe Biden said it was the deadliest day for the Jewish people since the Holocaust, but also a dark day for the Palestinian people. He said far too many civilians have suffered far too much during this year of conflict. Kamala Harris also paid tribute to the victims of the 7th of October attacks and said the US would never lose sight of the dream of peace, dignity and security for all. She's also, of course, the Democrats' nominee in the presidential race and has done an interview to be broadcast tonight with CBS.
Do we have a real close ally in Prime Minister Netanyahu?
I think, with all due respect, the better question is, do we have an important alliance between the American people and the Israeli people? And the answer to that question is yes.
So what effect has the battle for the White House had on US efforts to influence its ally Israel? And how is the conflict affecting the presidential race? Well, we'll reflect on all that in just a moment with David Satterfield, former US ambassador to Lebanon. He's also been a special envoy for humanitarian affairs to the Middle East. But first, let's go to Alistair Dorber, the Times Washington correspondent. Good evening to you, Alistair.
Hi, Carol.
Good to have you with us. Tell us a bit more about how the US has marked the October the 7th anniversary, some of the events that we've seen today.
Yeah, so as you alluded to there at the start, there was an event at the White House today where Joe Biden spoke and spoke about the last 12 months and particularly October the 7th last year. That was at the White House, and then the Vice President Kamala Harris, the Democratic presidential candidate, planted a tree at the Vice President's residence in Washington. And spoke in similar tones. She's also, as the clip you played there, given an interview to 60 Minutes, a widely watched interview program on CBS, which goes out in about a couple of hours' time. And that clip where she's asked about whether or not the US has an ally in Netanyahu, her response, I think, there is really telling. It's quite clear that relations between the administration, Washington, the Biden administration, and the Israeli government really are at a pretty low ebb. The Americans have talked at length over the last 12 months since the attacks on October the 7th about their influence and about their cast iron security guarantees for Israel. But in return for that, I think they would expect some sort of influence over the way Israel's conducting the war. At the moment, it really doesn't feel as though American influence is having much effect at all.
Well, do stay with us, Alistair. Let's bring in now David Satterfield. He's a former US ambassador to Lebanon. He's also served as a special envoy for Middle East humanitarian issues for the Biden administration and previously Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs in the Trump administration. Good evening to you, David.
Good evening.
What do you think of the way that the US is not just marking this first anniversary since October the 7th, but just attempting to urge restraint on all sides? I mean, it doesn't, as we were hearing there from Alistair Dorber, our correspondent, it doesn't seem as though Benjamin Netanyahu appears to be heeding what the US president has been urging him to do in terms of his approach.
If we could unpack this just a bit, there are really three messages coming from the U.S. administration. The first is a message of resolute, robust support for Israel's right to self-defense. And I would remind here, it was Israel that was attacked on October 7th, and it was Israel that was attacked by Hezbollah without provocation on October 8, and both sources of attacks, Hezbollah from Lebanon, Hamas from Gaza, have remained on a daily basis since that time. So, support for Israel and its defense, message one. Message two, how you go about that defense matters greatly. Respect to the extent possible, given the deliberate co placement of military terrorist elements with civilian populations. It's hard, but you have to, we tell the Israelis, do as best you can to avoid civilian casualties. Third message, diplomacy. There will be no military only, kinetic only resolution, either in Lebanon or in Gaza. Kinetic action certainly has a critical role to play in both places, but the administration is correctly underscoring at the end of the day, there's got to be a political resolution here for there to be enduring safety and security for Israelis or for the people of Lebanon or Palestinians. So it's three messages conjoined, but all very hard.
Yeah, and indeed, I mean, we were hearing from the former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak earlier on the program, and he was saying that at the moment, the people of Israel are just not ready to talk about negotiation, to talk about talks, to talk about some kind of resolution which is not military, and that indeed, if anything, morale has lifted since Benjamin Netanyahu launched that significant offensive against Hezbollah. And that is presumably the reason why it appears that Benjamin Netanyahu's not really listening to those calls for restraint, for dialogue that we're hearing from the US. Hello, David. Are you still with us?
I am indeed. Dropped you for a moment.
Yeah, I mean, what do you make of this fact that at the moment we're hearing, and we were speaking to Ehud Barak earlier in the program, that the Israeli people are simply not ready to face up to negotiations for talks? What they want to see is Israel hitting back hard, as Benjamin Netanyahu appears to be doing.
Well, I think Ehud is correct in saying that the public appetite, the public stomach for things like a two-state resolution beyond the rhetorical deck is very limited. But at the same time, we believe there is a recognition that at the end of the day, kinetic action, while vital, while critical, cannot by itself get for Israelis, whether in the Gaza situation or Hezbollah in the north, the security that they're seeking and the ability to return to their home. But I'd have to make a point here, which is whatever the complications, and there certainly are, on the Israeli political side about political resolutions, the fact is that the blocks in place right now, both in Lebanon and in Gaza, do not lie with Israel. It is the non response for a full month now from Hamas to the proposal that would yield a ceasefire and end the deaths, end the destruction. No response whatsoever. And in Lebanon, Hezbollah has had since late in 2006, when the Security Council passed Resolution 1701 to agree to disarm and to move its forces north of the Litani River. It has done neither. It could bring this campaign to an end tonight if it were to accept an end to the rocketing of Israel, which means decoupling the Hamas Iranian association with Gaza, that justification, and to move its forces back. That would end the damage in Lebanon. It would end the fighting immediately. But Hezbollah has refused.
And of course, Iran is a big backer of Hezbollah. It also backs Hamas, for that matter, also backs the Houthis. The Israeli leader Benjamin Netanyahu has made it clear that he's preparing to retaliate against those Iranian missile attacks on Israel just under a week ago. Do you, as someone who knows this region really well, do you fear that he is preparing to actually launch direct strikes, perhaps even on Iran's nuclear bases, despite the US urging him not to do so?
I think the Israelis are taking very seriously the U.S. Council, which is provided at all levels of our government, from the president on, not to respond in a manner which would prompt a significant escalation. That doesn't mean don't respond, not at all, but don't do it in a fashion against target sets which would assure or virtually assure an escalation here. Israel is still contemplating its response. The US administration at ministerial level is still in discussion with the Israelis as we speak today. And I wouldn't comment on hypotheticals except to say this. The administration has noted, and I would as an analyst, that an escalation, a genuine regional conflict, is not inevitable here. There are constraining factors at play with respect to all of the parties, but that doesn't mean that the risk is not there and significant of miscalculation, misjudgment.
And just finally, do you think the hiatus, such as it is in the United States, we are now just weeks away from the US presidential election. Do you think that there is a sense in which Benjamin Netanyahu feels that that means he doesn't have to listen to what the US is saying so much?
You would have to address that question to Prime Minister Netanyahu. I would say this. I believe profoundly that Israel, that the Prime Minister do take seriously the concerns that we have expressed with specific regard to the current situation vis-a-vis Iran and target sets.
Well, it's really good to speak to you. David Satterfield, former US ambassador to Lebanon, also a former special envoy for Middle East humanitarian issues. Really good to speak to you. Thanks so much for joining us.